Have you ever read Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick? If you have, congrats. How are you feeling? I know it's kind of a lot. If you haven't, let me give you a brief plot synopsis, no spoilers. Philip K. Dick's 1968 novel is about a bounty hunter named Rick Deckard. If that name sounds familiar, it's because Ridley Scott's, I believe, 1983 film Blade Runner was loosely adapted from the book. Um, but it's about Rick Deckard, whose job is to basically hunt down and retire androids. But as he continues to do so, he starts to become somewhat disillusioned with his job. It certainly doesn't help that most of these androids, more often than not, are pretty indistinguishable from real people, leading to some questions about his own humanity, whether or not he's an android, something that I think is explored a little bit more in the sequel of Blade Runner, which I think is actually infinitely better than the first movie, but that's a bit of a hot take. Before reading Philip K. Dick's book, I hadn't really tapped into the sci-fi genre like as a whole. I'd read the first three Dune books during quarantine all the way back in 2020, but even then, other than Dune Messiah, I again another controversial take. I kind of think Dune Messiah is the best one that I've read so far. But other than that one, I didn't really like fall in love with the science fiction genre. I could definitely see where future writers and authors grabbed inspiration from. I could see how Star Wars grabbed so much inspiration from Dune in particular, but I didn't really fall in love with it to the point where I just started reading sci-fi just on a regular basis. I even after I read those three books, I still stuck to my preferred genres, which were usually like romances like Call Me by Your Name or literary fiction, stuff like Stoner, which I actually mentioned in my last video, things like that. But sometime last year, a friend of mine recommended Do Android Dream of Electric Sheep, someone who I trust with her literary opinions. And she even went as far as to say that the book was probably her favorite book of all time, if not, one of her favorites, which sort of surprised me. One main reason being that I always felt like sci-fi was not really a genre that a lot of women would say that they adored, that they loved, let alone have a science fiction book be their favorite book of all time. Stuff like Blade Runner in particular to me has always been associated with the male demographic. I mean, just literally speaking, factually speaking, I think like over 55 or 56% of sci-fi readers are men, whereas women, it's in the 40% range. It's not exact, but the majority of sci-fi readers are men. So to get a recommendation from her, such a glowing review, I sort of had to check it out, and I definitely did not regret doing so. It like immediately after I finished the book, I understood why it was her favorite book of all time, and I understood why it was a classic, or it was deemed a classic. I don't necessarily want this video to just be a review of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. I feel like you can already tell how I feel about it. I think it is incredible. If you don't already know, I didn't already say so. My notes are right here. So if I look right here, I am reading my notes. But the book, in my humble opinion, is probably one of the best books I've ever read. It is really short, but the themes are so impactful and so thematically relevant, especially now. And I think the way that Dick goes about portraying those themes, especially of what it means to be a human and humanity as a whole, and empathy's role into playing into that definition of what makes us human, I think is really moving, really interesting. And it might sound cliche to say this, but it truly makes you think. I mean, at least for me, it made me think about my own decisions, my own capacity for empathy or hatred or love, whether that's towards another person or for animals, which in the book more so than the movie really leans into animals as like a form of wealth or status, which is also such a unique perspective to have. It's impossible for me to point out a single flaw in the book, which I'm sure there are. I'm a believer in that there's not a single piece of art that is completely flawless. I know subjectivity uh, plays a role in that as well, but mean, that book is pretty much perfect. I'm not here to just sell you on the book, although, again, if you haven't read it yet, you definitely should. You won't regret it. But I sort of want this video to be a little bit more of a conversation or a thought on why science fiction is predominantly catered to, I'd say, the male gaze. When I say the male gaze, I don't mean like, the male gaze as I think most people think of it, but in the sense that the genre is, I think, catered to men more so than women. Where I'd say, especially contemporary fantasy, I think is more catered to women than men. Not that I want to sort of paint sort of gender divides. I think that's the main question I want to sort of not answer, but bring into conversation. General point being, you should read more sci-fi. I'll start with a quote from Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, just to sort of maybe give you a taste of the kind of writing that you'd be getting from a book like this. You will be required to do wrong no matter where you go. It is the basic condition of life to be required to violate your own identity. At some time, every creature which lives must do so. It is the ultimate shadow, the defeat of creation. This is the curse at work, the curse that feeds on all life, everywhere in the universe. I mean, come on. Let's start with what the world currently looks like. I know, kind of a bleak place right now. There are industries going digital only, killing physical media. There are AI data centers being built, ruining the lives of the nearby locals. Also destroying the environment, even more so than I think everybody already does. I mean, everything is exponentially more expensive. And there's always this like creeping, I think, well founded suspicion that corporations and businesses and companies are constantly trying to take advantage of you, or really just everyone trying to take advantage of you. And that isn't, unfounded. That doesn't just come out of nowhere. We are quite literally living through a time of like great technological advancement in the sense that AI is a part of our lives, but there is even more uncertainty, and the consequences of that same technological advancement are really catching up, and we're in a strange place where our laws and legislature and things of that nature uh, aren't catching up fast enough to the technological advancements that we're experiencing. So corporations take advantage. And if that sounds familiar to you at all, other than the fact that we're all living through it, it is, I think, a lot of science fiction, a lot of dystopian sci-fi worlds are built around that general idea of what it would look like to live in a corporate world. There is a lot of uncertainty, obviously, right now, and uncertainty comes with like a realization, at least for me, that the worlds of books like Dune, for example, are not so far off from where we are or where we might be in the future. I guess it depends on what you read, but in my experience with the genre sci-fi, sci-fi in particular doesn't offer a whole lot of escapism, at least not in the way that the fantasy genre does. I think fantasy in particular really caters to that power fantasy or romance or the intrigue or mystery that those books usually have to offer. The the foundations of a great story. But sci-fi, despite the fantastical elements that they might have, it's still very grounded in reality. I think the main differentiating factor between sci-fi and other genres like fantasy is that sci-fi sort of stays grounded in what will be rather than, what can be in one's imagination, which I think that alone is incredibly interesting. Like Dick's novel, for example, I don't think is, they're not the crazy writings of a man who's passed away. I think at this point it's prophetic. That might sound a little dramatic, and maybe it is, but reading sci fi has evolved from a warning to a genuine glimpse into what our future can be. And something that as profound as Philip K. Dick's novel, it shouldn't just be limited to, I think, the trappings of the male gaze. It's something that every single person right now should be reading, should be informed on. Because despite it being fiction, everything in that book in particular, in books like Dune, or books like The Will of the Many as a more contemporary example. They all come from very real issues, regardless of what the author may say, like for Project Hail Mary in particular. I think that alone is reason enough for everyone to be reading science fiction, at least in a way that differs from how people used to read it. There have been great thinkers over time who have read science fiction with a more critical lens, but I think now is the time for the average person to do so. I remember talking about Dune with a friend of mine on our way to go watch Project Hail Mary when that came out. And I was just saying how excited I was about Dune 3. I think the trailer just dropped, and me and another friend of mine were talking about it in the car, and we were super excited about it. And I remember she asked me, like, what is it about Dune that makes men like so excited? Like, why do men love Dune so much? And that was, I think, the first time in my life where I really realized, like, yeah, like men really do love Dune. I'm one of those guys. Like, I I'm a Dune guy. But while doing research for this video and sort of revisiting Dune and Dick's novel and those worlds, I sort of I remembered what Frank Herbert, the author of Dune, what his main message was. That core message warning people about hero worship, about placing like complete and full faith into one charismatic leader, and how that can lead to catastrophe if all of that faith placed into this one person is misplaced. I mean, here's a quote from Frank Herbert himself, not from the novels, just from himself, and I think it really sums up my interest in sci-fi now. Herbert says, all governments suffer a recurring problem. Power attracts pathological personalities. It is not that power corrupts, but that it is magnetic to the corruptible. I think that is such an interesting take to have. An interesting outlook on power and how power itself isn't necessarily evil, but that it really draws in evil people. For that reason alone, I feel like the argument for shortening that sci-fi gender gap becomes less of a simple recommendation and more of a necessity. But I'm not naive. I understand that that's easier said than done. The problem, I think, with science fiction, especially science fiction from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, is that the protagonists always feel more catered to men. Take Paul Atreides, for example, from Dune, or even Rick Deckard. They're both similar in a lot of ways, actually, in the sense that, well, for Paul in particular, he's a young man, he's unemotional, he is
He's
hyper
gay.
intelligent, he gets things done. He's the kind of man I can imagine a lot of men at the time, especially, could look up to. Whereas I feel like more women would have a harder time connecting to a protagonist like that, someone who is in a lot of ways very cold and gets even colder as the books progress. But someone like Paul Atreides is the classic hero archetype. I think the hero archetype has sort of changed over the years, especially to cater to more current sensibilities. But that, I think, is an example of why men love Dune and men love sci-fi, because the protagonists are usually men who are tormented by something. Maybe they hate their wives, like in Do Andrew's Dream of Electric Sheep. He doesn't hate his wife, but they don't get along. And they have these sort of character arcs that usually lean into the violence more so than, I think, a more emotionally mature response. Someone like Paul, spoilers ahead, the OG Anakin Skywalker, child murder and all. Uh, that's something that surprisingly, at least I've seen edits on like Instagram or TikTok of people like liking that for maybe the wrong reasons, but who am I to say? So, with all that being said, I think instead of allowing men like me to sort of monopolize the sci-fi genre, I really urge you to start with Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. And if you're feeling even crazier and you have more time on your hands, or you just love reading so much, um, maybe move on to Dune. Get ready for Dune 3. I don't think you'd regret that either, especially if you like Dick's novel. I mean, Dune, just like uh, Do Andrew's Dream, is thematically rich, super heavy. I think the kind of once in a lifetime book that you might not immediately connect with it, but you'll at the very least appreciate its placement in our history and literary history and sci-fi history, and what that means to us right now and the current times that we live in. I think I'll make a future video on the fantasy genre in sort of stark contrast to sci-fi in both world building and gender preference. It seems to me that fantasy to women is what sci-fi is to men. I don't think it is a crazy statement or assumption to make. I mean, the stats don't lie. And similar to sci-fi, I didn't start exploring the fantasy genre until relatively not that long ago after I finished reading Babel by R.F. Kuang. That's an incredible book as well. If you haven't read it, read that. But I think maybe for a future video, I'll do a deep dive into fantasy and its placement into the literary world and why I'm starting to really appreciate that and realizing that growing up, I mean, I read a lot of amazing books, but man, I really pigeonholed myself into just literary fiction. I missed out on a lot. So, with all that being said, thank you so much for stopping by. Subscribe, like the video if you want, or don't. It's up to you. And I'll see you next time.